Welcome back to Air Quality Matters and One Take. One Take, my take on a paper or report on air quality, ventilation and the built environment. One Take in that it's, well, in one take and tries to summarise for you a scientific perspective on something interesting in, well, usually 10 minutes or less, because who has the time to read all these amazing documents, right? This week, I wanted to talk to you about a paper that I thought was really great. It's a working paper from the National Bureau of Economic Research, the NBER, and it's titled Making the Invisible Visible, the Impact of Revealing Indoor Air Pollution on Behaviour and Welfare. And it's by Robert Metcalf and Seffy Roth. And it's essentially asking the question we all obsess over. If people could actually see the air they breathe, would they change their behaviour? And perhaps more importantly for the policymakers listening, is it worth the money to help them do it? The results are, well, quite frankly, staggering. So let's set the scene. We know we spend about 90% of our time indoors, right? And we know that indoor air can be significantly worse than outdoor air. But for most people, it's completely invisible. It's an unobserved good. You don't know if the air is toxic or pristine unless you have a monitor, and because you don't know, you can't manage it. The researchers set up a really clever field experiment right in London, in the borough of Camden. They recruited a random sample of households, not just people who were already worried about air quality, but a proper cross-section, and they gave them high-quality air monitors. Now, here's the kicker. For half the group, the control group, they put a sticker over the screen. So the monitor was recording data, sending it back to the researchers, but the homeowner couldn't see a thing. They were flying blind, if you like. The other half, the treatment group, got the same monitor, but after 2 weeks of baseline data, they took the sticker off. Suddenly, the invisible became visible. They could see real-time feedback on things like particulate matter levels, colour-coded from green, good, purple for hazardous, and so on. Now, before we get to what happened when the screens turned on, the baseline data, the before picture, is fascinating in itself. First off, they found that when people are actually at home and awake, what they call occupancy hours, between 4 p.m. and 11 p.m, indoor pollution wasn't just bad, it was significantly higher than the pollution outside. We're talking about 14.6 micrograms per cubic metre indoor versus 12.2 outdoors. And here is something I talk about a lot. They found that outdoor air pollution was not a good predictor of indoor pollution. The correlation in the waking hours was weak. This really hammers home the point that the pollution that we're breathing in our living rooms or our kitchens, for example, is largely generated by us, by our cooking, our cleaning and our heating. But there was also a really stark finding on inequality. They found a massive income gradient. Households with below medium income had indoor PM2.5 concentrations that were 20 micrograms higher than households with above medium income. That is a huge disparity. It suggests that the environmental justice element of this isn't just about where you live on a map relative to a factory. It's about the quality of the housing and the environment inside your four walls. So what happened when they took the stickers off? When they made the invisible visible? The results were dramatic. Giving people real-time feedback reduced indoor PM2.5 concentrations by 17% overall. But if you just look at those occupancy hours, the times when people are home and actually generating pollution, the reduction was 34%. To put that in context, the authors compare it to massive policy interventions. The London congestion charge, for example, the US Clean Air Act amendments. Those resulted in low single-digit or maybe teen-digit percentage drops in ambient pollution. This simple intervention of showing people a number on a screen reduced their exposure by a third. So how did they do it? Did everyone stop cooking? Did they stop living their lives? No, and this was the really encouraging part. The researchers found that the frequency of peak events, those spikes you get when you burn toast or fry steak, didn't change. People didn't stop cooking dinner, but the intensity of those peaks dropped massively. When they surveyed the participants, 72% said their main strategy was ventilation. They opened a window, they turned a fan on. The data backs this up. The researchers looked at the temperature difference between indoors and outdoors and saw it narrow in the treatment group, proving that people were actively flushing the air. It suggests that people value their daily activities. They want to cook and they want to light a candle. But when they see the numbers spike, they take immediate low-cost action to manage it. They open a window. They turn a fan on. They mitigate the risk without stopping the activity. Now, you might be thinking, that's great, Simon, but monitors cost money. Is it worth it? Well, the paper does something I haven't seen done very often. They ran a full welfare analysis. They calculated the willingness to pay, how much people value that cleaner air. They found that people were willing to pay about £4.80 for every microgram reduction in PM2.5. But then they looked at it from the government's perspective. They calculated the marginal value of public funds, or MVPF. Essentially, if the government spent £1 subsidising these monitors, what is the return on investment to society? Now, usually with public policies, you hope for a return of maybe £1.50 or £2 for every pound spent. The paper calculated that the MVPF was infinity. Let that sink in. Infinity. What that means in economic terms is that the policy pays for itself entirely. The cost of the subsidy is completely offset by the fiscal benefits. How? Well, when you reduce air pollution exposure by that much, remember we were talking 30%, people get healthier, fewer asthma attacks, fewer heart issues. They save the NHS money. But even more significantly, when people are healthier, they work more. Their productivity goes up. Their earnings go up. And when their earnings go up, their tax revenue to the government goes up. The researchers found that the increase in tax revenue alone from people being healthier and more productive was enough to cover the cost of the monitor's subsidy multiple times over. Even if you take conservative estimates, a £1 subsidy generates about £13 in government revenue over 20 years. It is a Pareto improvement. Everyone wins. It challenges the idea, if you like, that we can't afford to deal with indoor air quality. The reality is we can't afford not to. There is a really important nuance here about energy efficiency too. The authors note that while ventilation, opening windows, turning fans on, was the main way people solved the problem, this stands in tension with our drive to seal up our buildings' energy efficiency. Remember that reduction in the heating gap. If we just seal up homes to save carbon, but don't provide mechanical ventilation, and then we rely on people opening windows to stay safe from pollution, we are stuck in a loop. The paper explicitly warns that energy efficiency measures like weatherization could inadvertently increase pollution exposure if we aren't careful. It highlights that ventilation isn't just a nice to have, it's the primary mechanism people have to protect themselves right now. Now, before I wrap this up, it is worth pointing out a few limitations that the authors themselves acknowledge, because that's good science after all. First, their sample wasn't perfectly representative. The people who took part in Camden were generally wealthier, more educated, and more likely to own their own homes than the average Londoner. While they reweighted the data to try and correct for this, it's still something to keep in mind. There's also a bit of selection bias here as well. To take part, you had to respond to a letter, which means the participants were probably people who were already at least a bit more interested in technology or their environment than the average person. And finally, While the economic argument, that infinitive return on investment, is compelling, it relies heavily on health models that have a lot of uncertainty baked into them. But it's worth remembering that calculating the precise monetary value of health outcomes is always a bit of an estimation game. So what's the takeaway here? Well, for me, this paper is really interesting because it moves the conversation, as we often have to, from health to economics. And it's sadly the language that often gets policy moving. It seems to suggest, in this case anyway, that the deficit model, the idea that people just lack information, is actually true in this specific case, which is different to what we've heard in part one. When you give people the information, it appears here that they do act. They do change their behaviour, and that change is big. This paper certainly tells us that we need to stop treating indoor air quality as a private luxury and start treating it as a public health imperative with a massive economic upside. Whether it's monitors or air purifiers, which they also found had an infinite return on investment, by the way, the technology exists and can solve this. It appears anyway that we just need to make the invisible visible. That's it for this week's One Take. I hope this gives you some ammunition anyway, at least, the next time you're trying to justify the cost of a monitor or ventilation in a home. Thanks for listening. Do check out the show notes, and the link to the paper in there will be there as usual. And as always, please do check out our sponsors, Imbiot and Safe Traces. Without them, these podcasts would simply not be possible. See you again next week for part 3 in this series of the psychology of air quality.